This podcast includes explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Ersties podcast. I'm Pandora Passmore, and today we'll be talking about sexual fantasies. What do they mean? Where do they come from? Should we be worried? Can they help our sex lives? Who fantasizes about a bigger penis, a Republican or a Democrat? Is it common for someone to fantasize about being a human cow? Also, we'll be sharing our own secret fantasies. We talked to Justin Lehmiller, social psychologist, sex researcher, and author of the book Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Improve Your Sex Life.
The Ersties podcast.
Welcome, ladies. Happy New Year!
Welcome.
Happy New Year!
Let's get straight into first base. So, New Year's resolutions, what are they?
I'm actually going to go vegan for 2019.
Of course you are.
Not really.
God.
That's so cheesy. No.
Well, it's not cheesy though, is it? It's actually nuts.
Well, how about getting laid more?
Getting laid more.
Yeah.
You.
We'll get back to you.
All right.
I haven't really thought about my New Year's resolution, but I think I'll probably just do my New Year's resolution from last year.
What was that?
Quitting smoking.
Last year I actually made 18 resolutions for 2018 because they had a nice ring to it. But this year I want to try and be a bit more committed.
People make one resolution for New Year's, not 18.
I know, so I've got to be extra committed to my 19 resolutions for next year.
Did you complete them?
Nobody completes their New Year's resolutions.
But you made 18! So what do you mean you want to be more committed? In what regard?
In every regard, I guess, like relationships, money, decision making.
Okay, boring. So what about your New Year's resolution, Parlita? You surely have something better.
Well, I've actually thought about this and I got a good one. It's one that I keep also doing every year. But this year, for sure, I want to be exploring different fields of sexuality beyond normative scripts. AKA, I want to be finally plunging more into BDSM.
See you at the dungeon.
So, okay, really, are you going to go vegan or what are you going to do?
All right, forget about the vegan. Actually, my resolution is to stay more focused on my projects. I mean, like things that I have already done for myself. And also I want to realize more projects and make my dreams come true.
All right, Kylie Jenner. Realize stuff this year.
So you mean making a fantasy into a reality? What? Wow, what a coincidence. Since we're talking about that, let's talk about sexual fantasies and get on to our main course.
So, we finally have a sponsor. And this is none other than Ersties. That's right, the Ersties podcast sponsored by Ersties. Who would have thought it? This means if you want to see what our day job looks like, then head to ersties-podcast.com/Ersties. That's ERSTIES. Check out the video and follow the link and you'll receive 50% off your first month. Please note that the content is 18+. One last time, ersties-podcast.com/Ersties. Click the link, 50% off your first month. And you must be over 18. Now, back to the pot.
Okay, so ladies, let's talk about it. What does a sexual fantasy mean to you?
That's a very hard question. It's very philosophical.
Yeah.
We're getting straight into it.
You're asking us the meaning of life.
This is my bread.
Well, that's a good answer. I think it's tricky because it's hard first to define a sexual fantasy. And personally, I've been thinking about this, trying to do my homework, and I'm not sure that sexual fantasies are such a big part of my sexuality. Like I have such a huge interest in novelty and trying out new things in real life, but I do not fantasize too much about them. I think sexual fantasies are something, for me, it's like an experiment that I try to force myself to do in order to expand my, my sexual realm. but it's not something that comes naturally to me.
Like realizing your desires.
I guess, yeah. I guess I'm more dissociated than I want to believe I am with my own desires. Possibly.
I think for me, when I was younger, when I started to be sexually active, I think I had far more fantasies, very, very simple actually, than now. I think that at this point, I'm very similar to you. There are things that I see and they're like, oh my God, that's hot and stuff. And then it's like, okay, I need to make it real, you know? So it's more like, it's right now, living your dreams. Oh my God, that's so cheesy. But yeah, living the dream. And
You're definitely not vegan.
And for me, I actually really like that it's not a lived thing. It's a really imaginative thing, and you can come up with these stories. And I love how you can be so present in it, and it's like these things are actually happening to you.
Paulita, we're so baby.
That you know, it's just like telling a little story to yourself, and then you're in the room.
Yeah, I like. I think the other day, and I think that's something that I might never like make a reality. I was watching this film with that it's like based on this famous painting by this Japanese artist called Hokusai. That it's like, you know, like the typical paint of like this a woman lying naked and then her like being sucked by a giant octopus.
I knew she was going to say octopus. Yeah. It's an octopus one.
So there was like this film made like based on this painting, and they show the octopus, and I mean not sucking on a woman, but it's like kind of like this glitchy art, and then just there are like some parts in which it's just like the octopus and the tentacles just like bloop 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 with lots of fluid and stuff and beautiful colors, and that was so erotic that. Pretty much like when I was watching it, it really like had an effect on me. And I was like, oh my God, I just thought for myself, maybe I should like get more brains into like that sort of imagination. And so it was something special.
Put an octopus in your sexual fantasies.
Check.
Get some of those like tentacle sex toys.
And then just like switch on. Yes.
So where is the desire in that? What's the kind of like the fluid and the pulsating thing? Can you locate it, or it's more abstract?
I think it's more... I really like that bit that it was like so much like so like erotic and sexually charged, but at the same time it was something far more genderless and far less human. So it's like a little bit like breaking with the human side, because I think that I am like very much human oriented. Whatever that means.
More non-human fantasies.
In my
Aren't we all?
fantasies and my desires. And yeah, I think also lately I've been like thinking and questioning a lot of things about my gender identity and so on. So I think that was like a very beautiful input of like of like thinking beyond like some sort of like gender ideas, and also getting eroticized by far more things, like just like human parts. So yeah, I think it was fun.
So, ladies, when did you have your first sexual fantasy?
Okay, so I was thinking about this, and I recall one concrete moment when I don't even know how old I was. I must have been 9, I guess. I could check when this song came out by Madonna. Hey, Mr. DJ.
I feel like I get it already. I'm like, yes.
Go on.
I remember being in my room and having this fantasy of me dancing in a dance floor. I was listening to this song really loud and basically just rubbing against a pillow. I guess that's a common one.
On the dance floor.
Well, no, in my bedroom.
But imagining
being in the dance room, I guess being Madonna or something. Singing and like getting into this. It was more of an abstract, not so much of a concrete sexual practice that I would do, but more of a general like sexual feeling and being like engulfed by this sexual feeling and the music and just becoming a sexual being. I guess I would say that was my very first sexual fantasy.
Do you think it was the domination aspect of telling Mr. DJ to put the record on?
Do you think the video clips help?
I don't think I've seen the video.
Oh, it's great. You have to watch the video clip.
Is it Madonna doing the splits?
Madonna really, like, she does something. There's something just about her.
We have so much that we owe to her.
Number one sexual fantasy, Madonna.
Yeah. And also number one, Ursi's podcast, Sexual Fantasy. Get her on. What was your first sexual fantasy?
I don't know, for me somehow it's kind of like intertwined with my very first sexual awakening. You know, like the very first like set of images that you get from that is like, oh, like this is interesting, you know, and then you cannot really tell your mom about it, or if you do, you get like kind of a shut up kid, what are you saying? But I think it was like my very first sexual awakening was like I was at this bar for some funny reason. I was with my parents, and we had to eat something, and yeah, we just like the only thing we could find where we were was like this sort of like video bar where they had pizza and stuff. So the place was like kind of like a little bit dark and stuff, and they had like lots of TVs all over the place. And I was super young, so that wasn't like really a place I would go on a regular basis. She was like, my God, this is different. And they had lots of TVs, like playing MTV, whatever. And there was this video from Billy Idol, The Cradle of Love or so.
Oh my God. Yes, go on, sorry. You are so not vegan. What is going on today?
And the video is about like this, I don't know, like this woman that knocks on the apartment of like this dorky looking guy. She was like, oh, can I come in? And he's like, ugh. And then she just like invites herself in, puts a tape in the tape player, record player. What do you call
Cassette player?
The cassette player.
Hey, Mr. DJ.
Another one is, and then she just like starts going crazy with the music, like dancing all over the place, like trashing the apartment and just like going crazy, obviously in a very like feline and sexual way. And the dork dude is just like looking at her without knowing what to do and stuff, and she's like owning the whole shit, right? And it was like, oh, this is so cool. I really wanted to be like her. It was like, oh my God, this is like really something. So it was like somehow in a sort of like kind of like projection of what what I wanted to do when I grew up, you know, in a way. and yeah, and at the same time, like, yeah, like admiration and something far more sexual. And so it's pretty much intertwined for me because I really projected myself. It wasn't something just, I don't know.
Singing out loud and smashing the place.
Yes.
The loss of control, I guess.
Yeah, but it's also like owning the shit because
Right.
she was just like her to take over like his place, and then just like it was like lots of charge like with self-eroticism because the other guy just they're like looking, you know, it's like
I love how you fantasize about embodying this person. Like,
yeah,
that's so great.
because I think it was. I mean, if you're a kid and at home I didn't have any cable TV or anything, so everything I watched was just like cartoons and stuff. So it was like the very first time that I got in touch with this sort of like materials that were kind of like more adult. So to speak, so it was for me like, oh my God, so women can be like that as well? Oh, I want to be that, you know? It was enlightening.
Fuck Disney princesses.
Yes, yes.
So what about you, Pandora? When did you fantasize?
My first sexual fantasy was Jessica Rabbit.
Oh, lesbian classic.
She looked great, and I was like, I think the first cartoon I've ever saw where the cartoon was so sexy, and I was like, oh my God, I'm really into her. But I feel really kinky right now because it's not allowed to feel this way. But Olivia, what was your first sexual fantasy?
I don't remember specifically my first sexual fantasy, I don't think. But I mean, I guess you saying that makes me I definitely had a big thing around like Tomb Raider and video games when I was younger. I don't know what that's about.
I see we're all wanting to
guess
fantasize about
everyone
being
has
independent women, but it's really nice.
This is the fantasy.
That is interesting that all these like empowering images of a powerful women, we're awakening our sexuality.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about that.
Because if you're a kid, it's like the kid stuff, or you have like also like very much reinforced the role of like the mother or like your aunties or your like grandmothers, which is like super desexualized, like all these images. So you don't get to see like this other side of what femininity can be. So the first time that you encounter is like, oh, you feel it, that you can also be that, or that you can also be there, or that it all brings you something, right? So.
On the Ersties podcast, we had some listeners call in to tell us about their sexual fantasies.
Oh my gosh, who's on line number 1?
We have Geraldine on the phone.
Hello, this is Geraldine.
Hi, Geraldine, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear, Geraldine.
Am I on air?
You are live.
We may edit this if you don't hurry up.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you about my sexual fantasy. I like to imagine that I am abducted by a dying race of aliens that need my sperm to save their species. I picture being restrained in a futuristic space chair while they use a special alien fleshlight machine to milk my penis over and over and over again.
And over and over and over.
Oh, well, thank you, Geraldine. I need a minute right now. All right, next we have Alex.
What's up? I eat a bunch of food. Usually something super caloric or hearty, but instead of getting fat over a long period of time, I grow a massive dick. Like all of the food is going to my dick. And then I fantasize about someone giving me a blowjob with my new massive, gigantic dick. I'm a girl, by the way.
Thank you, Alex. Great call.
That was an unexpected twist.
Beatrice.
Hi, hello. Yeah, hi, I'm Beatrice. Yeah.
Hello, Beatrice. How are you?
Hi, yeah, so shall I just go?
Yeah, just do it now,
okay,
do it now.
All right, so I fantasize I'm ridiculously powerful. I live naked in the mountains, no contact with the rest of the world, except that frequently I jump up and grab Superman out of the sky, drag him to my mountain, and just rape the shit out of him. I fall asleep spooning him, and when he tries to leave, I wake up, calmly beat him within an inch of his life, rape him again, and go back to sleep, spooning him again.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Beatrice.
All right, yeah, thanks.
That was romantic.
That was very sweet. Oh, I would like to go on a holiday with her. So those were some of our listeners calling in. So, ladies, should we share our own fantasies, perhaps? Did we do our homework?
Well, yeah. I think my fantasies, I wish they're not about like Supermans or like foot dicks, whatever. My fantasies are more into kind of like reverting stuff that actually happened to me, but like giving things like a happy ending. I had, for example, this recurrent fantasy of like this guy that I met, and I had a Tinder date with him, and the Tinder date was like really awful. I left like his place just like, oh my God, like really grossed out about the person. So now I like to think about it and go back to that fantasy, but just like get off about like how fucking disgusting he is and like how much of a piece of shit he is. And I just like to, I don't know. It's kind of like reverting all the things that went wrong during that date into like a truly pleasurable experience for me. And like this part of like of me like thinking he's such like a worthless piece of shit and really meaning that, and getting off on like how much he disgusts me. It's something I really enjoy, and that it's like really safe, so to speak.
Do you think it'll give you closure onto the situation of how bad the date went?
I mean, I already over the whole experience, and then when I was like, I surprised myself just like thinking about it, because like fantasies, you don't plan them, they just like come to you. So then like I was surprised about thinking about like this person, and was like, oh my God, this asshole, how did he come into? I was like, okay. I mean, I just accepted it, and then I just analyzed it. It's just like, okay, it's just like twist like the ending, you know, into something that is like pleasurable for me, and it's something that it's cool and safe. And also because even when I am like into like some other like forms of play in which are like more like treating like people like shit, or like kind of like topping or dumbing, and so I do it from a point of view that it's like focused so much on like caring about the other person, or like even if I'm being rough, I'm being always like caring and attentive. And so by just like being like disgusting and not having to care, and then just like kind of like hating, or in a way it's something that it's kind of like radical for me and for what I do. So I guess I just take it as something like positive, like a new dimension of like the pleasure that I can get without like having to care at all, and just like hate and disgust and like fucking asshole. If you're listening to that, I hope you die.
Like you don't have to worry about
Yes.
it. Perfect.
Yes.
So it kind of takes the responsibility away from you having to...
Yeah, the responsibility and just like twisting things on my own terms. So
I can
that's a cool
totally
thing.
relate to that. I've been noticing myself this strategy of eroticizing situations that might have not been pleasurable or might have been really bad. Actually, recently, or like not so long ago, I got robbed in the street. Like somebody pulled me, kind of choked me and pushed me down on the floor and ran away with my bag. Which was, you know, in the first moment a bit shocking and, you know, didn't feel great. And then in the course of the next weeks, I caught myself eroticizing the situation and thinking about him, his body pressuring into mine and choking me from behind. And I imagine I imagine what if because the only thing I saw from him was his hands, right? So I imagine what if he would have had this very special ring that I would then recognize, you know, at the shop or something, like see his hand and be like, oh, this is the man that robbed me, and then like seduce him and get into a thing with him. It's funny. It does take the fear away, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's great. Like turning a potential rape scene into something that's enjoyable. Great. I love it.
Okay, I'm going to give you a specific one. We're in a hotel room. It's been a romantic evening. You're lying in bed together. You know, it's typical romantic. You've had sex. But then he wakes you up by tying something around your neck and then latching on like a leash, and then just ties you to the corner of the room and then goes out and just leaves me there. And it's just like totally abandoned, but for hours.
So you're totally submissive at this point.
It's
like,
a really submissive, like, humiliation thing, but it's almost like a maltreated animal type situation. So then when he eventually returns, like, I've pissed myself, it's a mess, you know, it's really disgusting and embarrassing. He comes in and is just, like, shaming me for it. What have you done?
Interesting. Why do you think this turns you on a little bit?
Again, I think it's trying to make things that are shameful or embarrassing or being disgusted with yourself into a positive, like you shouldn't be feeling this way, into a positive thing.
Oh.
Ooh, I love it.
I'm really
It's
into it.
really cool. I like it.
I'm like, mental note.
Chris. Nice one.
And I like the idea of just, you know, that you've been there so long that you're totally weak. You can't even stand up properly. You haven't been eating.
Oh. Abandonment. What about you, Pandora?
I think lately I've just been kind of changing my personality, how I am in bed. Like, I was finding myself, I'm very submissive, and I like to be submissive as well. I enjoy that. But lately I've been fantasizing about me being more dominant in just like my personal character as well. And I really would like to tie someone up now and like hang them. So actually we could do it, Susanna. Yeah. Wait a minute. Hey. Like I'm not ready to not feed you, but we can
Tie me up, kick my water bowl away from me. No!
Knowing me, I'll probably be, are you okay? It's okay. Can you breathe? You're good? Okay, cool. Lena and Palito is going to come check in on you while I go to school.
School.
Yeah, I also have been playing with like a student-teacher thing as well, but like, you know, that's off-field.
Yeah.
But no, I've been just being more like, but it's nothing actually even more like any sexual doing. It's just more, my personality is just more dominant in my fantasies. So I just enjoy that.
That's might be one of my New Year's resolutions, go into more dominant fantasies, because I do have the very recurring like rapey ones with like, you know, kind of like gangbangy and a lot of guys, they're all using all my holes and that kind of thing. So
Yeah, that's a good one.
yeah.
Heavy rotation.
So this is like a pretty like important question in regards of like, how do you see yourself in your sexual fantasies? Do you change who you are and everything, or do you stay the same? Like I changed mine. I become more dominant in my fantasies.
But you're still you? Or
I'm still me, but my personality is more dominant, and I've changed that part of me. Like, do you change how you are in your fantasies, you'd say? Are you still you?
Interesting, even the fantasy image of yourself just sexually in general. What is the erotic thing in yourself?
I think I'm still myself, but it's just like myself in control. And I think that in the past I used to have also like more fantasies about being more dominant and stuff, but I think that at this moment I am kind of like how in the process of like putting in practice a little bit more of how can I be as a dominant person. Because as you have said, I think I'm very much at ease at being submissive and stuff. And being dominant has like been on like also my wish. It's like, oh, how will I be, or how will I be that way? But I right now like kind of like try to put it in practice and finding somehow my own style. So I think that halfway through the fantasy and the reality.
I was thinking about this a little bit when we were talking about Madonna and this stuff at the beginning, of this empowering women and it not being necessarily the kind of, oh, I'm going to be a mum pushing my doll around in a pram type thing. But I think I've actually gone more in that direction as I've sexually matured. Like I found more primitive instincts to be incredibly erotic. Like, you know, like having someone suck on your breast and feeling like maternal in it, or having a threesome and inviting a woman round, but being kind of like the mother of the situation and like holding them in my arms. I think it always comes up when there's always that gag about breast milk in sitcoms and like someone accidentally using the breast milk in tea, and it's all disgusting and everything. And I'm like, okay, well, if my partner didn't drink my breast milk, I'd be really offended. I would really enjoy that. I think that would be really, like, that is still a sexual thing for me. I think it's strange that we desexualize primitive things like that.
I think like the other day, one of someone I was sleeping with was like, I don't care that you're on your period. I want your blood all over my face. And I was like, oh my God, I really like you right now.
Aww.
Wow.
That's really sweet. How about you, Palita?
It's a good question. I think generally I'm a better version of myself in my sexual fantasies. Often it does... like also in a physical way, like I think I do project myself as being this very sexual, like I guess kind of mainstreamy, normative
Slut.
So I never consciously thought about it so much, but now that I think about it, I realize, I like pump up my boobs and my ass and like really push me into this. I guess it's a teenage thing. I guess as a teenager, I really like, I had more issues with my body, and I was like, you know, had these aspirations of having like a more, you know, woman curves, big boobs, porn star-y kind of self. And I think that still is something that is recurrent in the projection that I have of myself. But I'm still myself, I would say, in all of my fantasies, and it is about me. Like there's a lot of me in there.
Does that image of yourself ever occur to you in sex? Are you ever have a sense of yourself more in that way?
That's interesting. I think that's something that I used to do more as a teenager or when I was younger, like trying, you know, when you're super self-conscious about your body and the positions, and you're like, do my boobs look right when I'm lying here? You know, how does my ass look from his perspective or her perspective? And I think it's something that I think it's positive. I've managed not to do that so much and let go when actually having sex in real life, not to be overconsciously and aware of like how does my body look right now, but just go with the feeling and
Being a sex worker, do you think like the way of how you see yourself projects your sexual, like?
Absolutely. I think as a sex worker, obviously we are working with, then again, other people's fantasies, right? And we are projecting ourselves into the ideal of the person that is like acquiring our services. And I think that's something that feels for me very easy to do, like try to pleasure someone else's like sexual desires. So definitely, I think possibly one of the reasons why I am a sex worker is because I do have a tendency to actually want to fulfill other people's fantasies, right? So that definitely plays a role in it, I'd say.
No matter what, and I think that's also something very important to talk about, like no matter what sort of line of sex work you are in, it's the job of projecting an image that it's like a fantasy. And that should be something that it's normalized, that we will like need to take more into account. And in some ways it can be fun. I also like that. I have like this sort of, as you said, like this, it's fun to sometimes try to project something, or try to experiment with things that you're not, and then just, it's fun and it's interesting, and seeing that people like it, and so it's cool.
Is it easy to switch out of that?
Yeah, it's easy because, and that's part, I would say that it's part of like, since it's part of your job, if you're professional enough and if you like learn about it and so on, then it's something that it's like easy to come out with. I think it's more easy to perform that being, that it's more easy to perform in front of a camera than perform for your lovers or partners.
I agree, absolutely. It's the same with acting. Like you are doing a performance and that gives you the security and the safety of being in a role. Like how you on stage you can be naked and crying and vomiting or I don't know what. It's not you though. Everyone knows it's not you. You are playing, you are performing, you have this role. So I think it is actually a very safe space to do that.
I think it's very interesting that you find it easier to fulfill someone else's desire except for your own. So, I think that's very interesting.
Catch me.
Well, it's like that's a longer, more complex, more personal journey. That's.
Do you guys share your fantasies with your partners, or do you find it easy to share it?
I do, for sure. But I think sometimes that there is a problem with that, and that my fantasies change quite frequently, and then maybe you'll be having sex and they're referencing a fantasy from like last week, and I'm like, I'm not really into that anymore.
Millennials.
Why are you talking about incest? Where is this coming from? Oh, right.
That's so passé.
That was so 2018.
I'm over that now. I think that's especially when you have really freakish fantasies, it really requires you being very turned on and in that moment. And when you hear those things, when you're not necessarily in that space, it's quite a confusing sort of story to hear.
I can imagine.
Yeah. What do you mean you're just going to leave me for hours?
Don't you love me?
Yeah.
I don't like it up here. I'm scared of heights. How come you don't know about this? Oh, my Lord. How about you, ladies?
For me, there is something I share, and that's some that I keep to myself. For me, it's in any sort of relationship situation, freedom, it's super important. And no matter how much in love you are, or whatever you want to call it, it's always really important to have a sense of individuality. And I think it's actually a very healthy thing not to share absolutely everything, and also I don't want my partners to share absolutely everything with me. There's always something that I would like to keep for myself, and I will also appreciate the freedom of the other person to keep like a number of things for themselves. So I like both, the combination of both.
I absolutely agree. I think in a way sharing fantasies, I think I've learned a about my fantasies and developing them with partners. Like partners have helped me like together to, it's a kind of a game, right? And you get into
What
it.
happens
and then
next?
What happens
And
next?
then what do you do?
So I think it's definitely, it can be definitely a part of a shared sexuality with a partner. I think it's a beautiful thing. However, I agree with you, Lina. There are some things that might not want to be shared. Also, I think you do have to create a safe space in the relationship to share those fantasies. I've experienced maybe something that is where it can go wrong, which is you're sharing a fantasy and you think, you're both into it. And then at a later point in the relationship, maybe that can be used against you. Oh, but you were fantasizing about the yoga teacher. Do you like the yoga teacher more than you like me?
Yeah, I've noticed you've been going to yoga 3 times a week.
Yeah, exactly. So it is tricky. I think it is something, like anything, obviously, sexuality-wise, not only fantasies, but you do need to create that safe space with your partner. Communication is very important. Consent, and like make it, establish some frame where you're sharing those fantasies. I think it's an important part of it.
Safety first, kids.
And what about fantasizing about other people or aliens or octopuses when you're having sex with your partner?
I never tell the octopus.
The octopus is oblivious. That's something that I feel very, very guilty about when I do it. I do it sometimes, but I feel I would never share that with a partner.
No. But
Don't ever do
But
that.
everyone does it, right?
Yeah.
Everyone does, right?
Yeah.
It's safe, and I think it's better not to tell at something. You're not harming anyone, and being way too honest, and I think it's for yourself. So it's you don't really need to tell that. And if my partner does the same, it's just theirs.
Yeah.
Like, if you feel guilty about it doing it once in a while, I don't think it's a problem. But if you're doing it over and over again, then
Right.
maybe you need to...
Maybe that suggests...
Then maybe there's something about the relationship, not about your sexual fantasies.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Good point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Talking about bringing other people into your sexual fantasies, we're bringing in the unicorn, Justin Lehmiller. He conducted one of the largest surveys on sexual fantasies and wrote the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. We talked to him about his findings.
My name is Justin Lehmiller. I am a research fellow at the Kinsey Institute. I am author of the blog Sex and Psychology, and I just came out with a new book called Tell Me What You Want, which is all about what our sexual fantasies say about us and where they come from.
And why do we have fantasies? Do you think it's because we're bored?
Well, it could.
Is it good for us?
Yeah. So we could have fantasies because we're bored. In fact, we see that that's one of the most common reasons that people do have fantasies. People fantasize when they're at work, when they're watching television, when they're at religious services. Fantasies can pop into our heads at various points in time as a result of boredom or just having a very active imagination. However, people also fantasize because they might want to increase arousal. So they might fantasize while they're masturbating or while they're engaging in sexual activity with a partner. So we can do it for different reasons, and it's generally thought to be a healthy thing. It's just a healthy expression of sexuality in most cases. There are certainly cases where fantasies can be problematic when they start focusing on, non-consensual and harmful activities, and that becomes your preferred fantasy content. But more often than not, fantasies are just a healthy expression of human sexuality.
So what are the most common types of fantasies that you found in your research?
So there were 3 types of fantasies I found that almost everyone reported having. The first of these was multi-partner sex, so having sex with multiple people at the same time, most commonly in the form of a threesome, but some people preferred larger groups. Second was what I call power, control, and rough sex. So that's all about various expressions of BDSM, going from bondage and spankings to more intense sexual activities. The third category that almost everyone reported was novelty, adventure, and variety. So this was just going out and trying something new and different for you sexually, like trying a new position or having sex in a new setting or, different room or different location. There were 4 other fantasies that were pretty common as well. These included engaging in taboo sexual activities, so things that are socially or culturally forbidden. They also included partner sharing and non-monogamy, so having some type of sexually open relationship. Included passion and romance fantasies, where you're trying to meet various emotional needs through your fantasies, like feeling desired, loved, or validated. And then finally, what I call the erotic flexibility and gender bending fantasies, where people are sort of pushing the boundaries and limits of their sexual orientation or gender role, such as by having a same-sex fantasy if you're heterosexual, or fantasizing about cross-dressing or having sex with a transgender partner.
I was very interested about the gender bending versus like sexual flexibility. Could you explain these terms?
Mm-hmm. So sexual flexibility is the term that I use to refer to this tendency for people to want to deviate from their sexual orientation, their sexual attractions. So people who are high on sexual flexibility, they might have a heterosexual orientation, but they're open to the idea of, say, having a same-sex experience, such as maybe a threesome with at least one other partner of the same sex. The gender bending, referring to people who fantasize about playing with their own gender role or expression in some way. So that could be cross-dressing, so dressing up as a member of the other sex, or it could be having sex with a transgender partner. So it takes different forms. But interestingly, I see that women have more of the sort of sexual flexibility fantasies. So, for example, heterosexual women have more same-sex fantasies than heterosexual men. But when it comes to the gender-bending fantasies, men have more of those fantasies than women do.
Can you tell us why?
I wish I could. I talk a bit in the book about some of the different theories, but we don't know for sure why.
Yeah, of course.
When it comes to gender bending, it might be that maybe it's more of a taboo thing for men to, violate norms and rules of masculinity, and maybe it's because it's more taboo that it's more appealing to them, because we see that people are really drawn to taboo activities.
Absolutely. Regarding men and women as well, could you tell us like the differences or even the similarities between our fantasies for men and women?
I found that men and women had a lot in common when it came to their fantasies, and that most of the things that men are fantasizing about, women are fantasizing about as well, and vice versa. However, there are some differences. For example, men have more frequent fantasies about group sex than women do, and women have more frequent fantasies about emotional connection and fulfillment than men do. So we do see there's a lot of overlap in our fantasies, but there are some important gender differences too.
I think it's very interesting how you perceive like the object of desire versus acting on the object of desire. And that was also like a difference. I was finding that really interesting. If you could explain a little bit more about that.
Sure. So this is another difference in men's and women's fantasies, where when women are fantasizing, they tend to see themselves as the object of desire in their fantasy. And so in other words, they're a bit more focused on themselves in their fantasies.
I'm guilty of that.
And a little less so on their partner. So interestingly, we see that women are more likely than men to fantasize about sort of a partner who's just sort of vague or faceless. They're just sort of a body without, it's not necessarily a specific person. By contrast, men are more likely in their fantasies to see themselves as acting on an object of desire. They focus more on their partner in their fantasies than they do on themselves. So I think that's a really fascinating gender difference there.
Moving to what the sexual fantasies say about you. This was my favorite part of the book. I thought it was super interesting how you broke it down as well. How a first sexual experience can basically give you the pathway of what your sexual fantasy will be in the future.
So, I found that some of the characteristics of people's first experience were linked to the kinds of things that they were fantasizing about as adults. So, for example, the activities that people engaged in the first time they had sex were more likely to be things that they fantasized about later on. For example, if oral sex was a part of your first sexual experience, you tend to have more oral sex fantasies later on. Also, if your first sexual experience was really unusual in some way, people tend to report more unusual sexual fantasies later on. So it does seem that those early experiences might sort of shape or set the tone for our sexual fantasies going forward.
the victims of a sex crime, you are actually, I'm quoting here, that you argue that the fantasies are adapting coping mechanisms for dealing with sexual trauma and could be viewed as a sign of a psychological resilience, and that BDSM and sexual trauma are not linked. And like for some of us, we work in the sex industry, so that was really important for us to hear that. And if you could just tell us how people are with the victims of sex crime affects their sexual fantasies.
So I found that there was a small but statistically significant link between having been sexually victimized and having fantasies about BDSM. This was interesting to me because in a lot of other research I'd seen, they hadn't found this linkage. So I found it interesting that I saw this. And in talking with a number of sex therapists after writing this book, I found that that has come out in their clinical practice, where they have victims of sex crimes who then have BDSM fantasies. And we think what may be going on here is that this is a way that they cope with or come to terms with the experience that happened to them. So, for example, somebody who was sexually victimized might fantasize about forced sex. But when they have sex forced on them in their fantasy, they are taking control of it in terms of who the other person is and the terms under which this happens. So it may be a way that victims assert control over previous experiences that they've had.
Okay, perfect. And with this was also religious and political background.
Right. So I wanted to look at how our political identities might be related to our fantasies. And this was also part of the reason why in this book I focused specifically on Americans, because I wanted to look at how American culture is reflected in our sexual fantasies. But what I found was that people who self-identified as Republicans, who are more conservative, they tended to have more taboo sexual fantasies. They had more fantasies about infidelity and orgies and swinging, where they're sort of swapping partners with other couples. And I found that Democrats had more fantasies about BDSM. So we see some interesting political differences there.
Could you tell us about what the big penis means differently from a Republican versus a Democrat?
Yeah, so that was another political difference in people's sexual fantasies, where Republicans, regardless of their gender and sexual orientation, when they fantasized about penises, they fantasized about larger penises. So I suspect that may have something to do with Republicans potentially seeing the penis as more this symbol of power than Democrats. And so as a result, maybe it pops out more in their fantasies.
I wonder how big Donald Trump thinks. If you could tell our listeners about racial preferences that is happening in America.
Right. So I thought this was a really interesting thing that came out in my survey. I found that white people fantasize predominantly about other whites, but for no other racial group was there such a strong in-group preference. And in fact, in some groups, they were fantasizing predominantly about the out-group. And in one case where I really saw that was among Asian Americans, who fantasized predominantly about white people and very rarely about other Asians. And I think that this speaks to certain stereotypes about race and sexuality that exist in American culture and society, where whites have kind of historically held the most social and political power, and they've kind of been able to set the standards for what is beautiful and attractive, and leads to certain patterns of racial preferences in our fantasies that I think reflect ultimately racial biases. And I know that's an uncomfortable thought, but I think it's the reality of what's happening.
A big component of our fantasies is not just about the other person, but also how we see ourselves. And if you could explain to us what might be the reason why we might change ourselves physically, or even our personality, which I thought was very interesting.
So there really hasn't been any previous research looking at how we see ourselves in our fantasies. And that was really one of the things that drew me to do this work, was because I wanted to look at how we represent ourselves and why we might change ourselves. And I found that most people fantasized about changing changing themselves in some way. But men and women actually did it in somewhat different ways, with women, for example, fantasizing more about changing their bodies, and men fantasizing more about changing their genitals. So I think that might reflect different cultural pressures on men and women for, what is considered ideal sexually. There's more pressure on women to look a certain way and for men to have large penises. So I think that is reflected in how they tend to change themselves in their fantasies. But we also see that people sometimes fantasize about changing their personality, where if you're, for example, a very submissive person by nature and you don't tend to initiate sex very often, you might fantasize about becoming more dominant and vice versa. So we see that people might change themselves in all sorts of ways in their fantasies.
So Viagra is one of the best-selling medications on the planet. Why do you think this is happening? Why are people choosing to pop a pill instead of trying to find a different method of trying to figure out why they are sexually incapable for that moment?
So when it comes to sexual problems, especially in the United States, people have a tendency to want to do whatever is simple and easy. And that is really ultimately taking a pill. And I think people are really drawn to the idea of taking medications for sexual problems because it's easier to pop a pill than it is to talk about sex with your partner. Now, the unfortunate reality is that most sexual problems are actually psychological in nature, and many of them can be solved through improved sexual communication with a partner and by removing shame and guilt that stem from people's feelings about sex. And Masters and Johnson, who were the founders of the modern sex therapy movement, recognized this back in the 1960s, and they developed a treatment approach that was all based around communication and intimacy in relationships. But we've kind of gotten away from that, and we've moved to this model of just popping a pill whenever we have a problem. And I think we need to sort of go back to the Masters and Johnson approach and start looking more at improving intimacy and communication as a way of resolving sexual problems.
I really agree with you on that. So what do you think is the best strategy for us to be able to share our fantasies with a partner?
So there are a few things there. When it comes to sharing fantasies, it's important to pick the right time and setting to do that. You don't necessarily just want to come out with this over dinner because, that might not be the ideal setting. So ideally, try to do it when you and your partner are both already relaxed and maybe a little aroused, because you're more likely to be receptive to each other's ideas. So, maybe do this after you've watched a Stevie movie or you've seen a sex scene on television together or something like that. And then sort of start low and go slow, meaning, don't necessarily start with your most adventuresome sexual fantasies, but kind of, start out with some of the tamer ones and then kind of move from there. So think of this as an evolving process of self-disclosure, and you're going to be building up trust and intimacy over time, and you can get to the more adventuresome ones later on.
Of course, you're like a sex psychologist, so you'd understand what would be the common problems that make us hesitant to share fantasy with a partner.
And that's a very complex question, right? Because there's a lot of factors. One is that socially, culturally, there's so much shame that's built into how we think about sex because of, say, religious teachings we've had, or what our political parties tell us is acceptable and so forth when it comes to sex. So part of it is at the cultural level. Then there's also the sex education issue. A lot of us have just never learned how to communicate about sex. And the American sex education system is incredibly poor. There's so much that we could learn from the way that they do it in a lot of European countries, like the Netherlands, where there is this strong focus on sexual communication that's built into the way that they teach children and adolescents about sex. So, there's sort of the lack of education piece. And then there's also, when people are in relationships, they are worried about their partner judging them. So they don't really know how to kind of go about doing it because they can't let go of the shame and guilt. So it's really this complex phenomenon that can be hard to address.
And in your experience, would you find that sharing a fantasy was a positive or a negative, or both?
So more often than not, when I asked people what their experiences were like acting on their fantasies, they reported positive experiences. They said it was better than they ever expected and that it improved their relationship for the most part. There was some variability across different types of fantasies. So, for example, group sex fantasies like threesomes turned out the least well when people acted on them. And I think that's because a lot of people just don't have a script for how that's supposed to go. They don't have experience. And so they get into that situation and they're not really sure what to do. But other types of fantasies worked out really well, like the sort of passion and romance fantasies and the novelty fantasies. Those tended to have very positive outcomes.
Okay, so then now we have to ask, where is the line between a fantasy and a reality? When does it start to become a nightmare? And what are the signs that we should be keeping an eye on so that we know that something could be potentially be harmful?
So the fantasies that are red flags or warning signs would be the ones that are about truly non-consensual activities, right? So where the other person is not a consenting party, or where there's a serious risk of harm coming to you or someone else. So if it focuses on a really dangerous and risky sort of activity. If you just have sort of these kinds of fantasies on the rare occasion and, that's not your preferred fantasy content, it's probably nothing to worry about because I find that it's not uncommon for people to have really dark thoughts every now and then about sex or something else. But if something really dark like this becomes your preferred fantasy and you're thinking about it all the time and you're worried that you might act on it, then that's a sign that it's might be time to seek help from a professional.
And in conclusion of the book, if you could just share with us and our listeners what would be the best strategy for us to be able to communicate openly about our sexual desires and in turn hopefully have a healthier and happy relationship with not just only other people but with ourselves. What would be the best way to go about that?
So there are a couple of things here. One would be to support efforts to reform sex education in your local area, because that's often governed on a local level. And I think that the earlier we can start teaching people sexual communication skills, the better off we're all going to be. But also, just when it comes to you and your relationship, start a norm early on in the relationship of talking about sex. And the more comfortable you are communicating about sex early on, the better things are going to be down the road. Because if you wait too long to start having these conversations, it just tends to get awkward and more difficult to do it. So it's really about sort of establishing that norm early on so that you can open the door to having better conversations and ultimately better sex.
Could you also share with us maybe a fantasy that really got your attention, and maybe if you could tell us like the psychology behind that, break it down a little bit for us?
There were several that caught my attention.
I could imagine.
Because I was reading through 4,000 some fantasies. But one that I always go back to that I thought was so interesting was one that this participant described as being a human cow. And essentially what her fantasy was, it involved her being force-fed hormones that would make her lactate continuously, and she would be tied up in the center of town, and people would come and milk her and have sex with her at will. At first, when I read this fantasy, I'd never heard of anything quite like it before. But after writing the book, I found that there's actually this whole porn genre that's devoted to human cow porn. And you can find hundreds of videos of this on Pornhub and other websites. And I think it's really this interesting fantasy where it's a combination of a fetish for erotic lactation, but also with this big BDSM component because there's dominance and submission and sort of this sadomasochistic element to it as well. So I think it's really ultimately just sort of stemming from the same factors that might draw people to BDSM in the first place.
Thank you. I don't have any more questions, but thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me and for supporting the book. And I'm so glad to hear that you all are enjoying it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. We look forward to your future work as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.
Interesting that Justin Lehmiller says that sexual fantasies relate to your first sexual experience. Do you agree with him on that?
I actually find it really interesting, and it has brought me to think about my first sexual experiences. And I realized that I was actually thinking about the very first times that I was like really getting sexual with someone. And then suddenly from the back of my head, stuff popped up that was like before that. So, the doctor games with your friends.
Oh, yeah.
Interesting, isn't it? Like, it was something that I was like, I've been thinking so often about, the first time that I made out with someone, or that, someone fingered me, or so on and so forth. And then suddenly from somewhere very, very deep, it was like, no, wait, your sexual awakening, your first sexual experience was before that. And it wasn't cold sexual. You were playing... Actually, we were playing rape games with my girlfriends.
How did that... Wait, how? You're going to have to go into more detail about that because that's going to be confusing.
Well, when you don't know what rape is and then you just repeat the word.
Exactly. Well, we did not call it rape, of course. But I remember this one time that I was with I had two friends. They were girlfriends. And we had built a tent in the garden, and we were playing with that. And then I think one of them, it was definitely not me. One of them came up with the idea, like, let's play, we're like camping. And then two of us go pick up wood or whatever. And then the other one got to sleep in the tent. And then these evil boys that are camping like next to us come and pretend to be the girls and give you a massage. Isn't that twisted?
Well, at that age, it made sense, And then society was like, no, that's not allowed.
I guess there's a lot of these experiences when, like, one of the girls was older than me, I think, right? I think I've been thinking about this also, like my flatmates as a kid, and hearing about like his first, sexual, whatever, like, experiences. Like, I think it is very often that an older kid actually introduces sexuality into a game with younger kids. And that is something that is very tricky because it's hard to control and it's hard to protect your kid actually from those experiences that might be great or might... Like, you don't want to be shaming them, punishing them for doing it because you want them to explore. But you also want to be protecting them from coming in too early, maybe into an experience that might be not quite be ready to cope with or understand, right? I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, as in, like, you don't want to introduce your child too early, but I find it interesting that it wasn't making out that was your first sexual experience. It was playing with your girlfriends and having to just dip your toe into a sexual idea more than anything.
I think that's that we did use play. You use play to explore these things, and I suppose it's the same now. And having fantasies, it's a similar instinct that, like, playing games. Well, not games, but sense of play.
Right.
It's about exploring more than just entertaining yourself.
I think for me also, like, if like going down like similar path than you, Paulita, kind of like analyzing like the things that happen, or like the kind of like subtext with within like your fantasies and so. For me, it's very funny because I think that my first like sexual experiences that I didn't call sexual, but where I consented, for example, they were like mostly with girls, and they were really safe and they were really cool. I'm actually, there's like a very like kind of like, like kind of like stories, but a little bit like more, it was a little bit more like upfront. Like, for example, one time I was with a bunch of friends who were like, oh yeah, let's all make out. Okay. And then we just made out. And then it was like nothing like really sexual. It was just like more the experiment, And we knew that we didn't have like to tell our parents about it, but still it was just like, it was cool, but nothing like super like over like sexualized, more like exploring whatever. But I think that for me, it was more like, it's more like the part of like overpowering situations in which I was somehow like harassed when I was a kid. Like, for example, I had like this very like vivid experience of like once being like at school, and somehow we were like wearing my uniform, whatever, and somehow I was like walking through a bunch of like people, like somehow like parents or whatever, and then someone like groped me. I was just a kid, and I was like, oh, and even like when you're just like a very like small kid, like sometimes you don't even like get like the full dimension of what that is, but somehow it feels grown because someone like feels like unfamiliar and strange. And that moment I didn't feel attacked, I didn't feel like traumatized. I was just like, that was weird. And I just like kept going with my life. But then now like all like this kind of like fantasies of like being disgusted at men, or like somehow like gangbangs and stuff. It has like, to me, they're all like very very phallic. And now I'm kind of like reading this into subtext, and it's more like overpowering like those situations in which I was like somehow abused. Yeah.
Yeah, I think sexual fantasies can really be used for emotionally processing, things like that. Remember that article that I sent you all by Stanley Siegel? He's the writer of Your Brain on Sex. And he actually writes about sexual fantasies having roots in much even earlier experiences than what we're discussing in terms of your relationships with your family, your parents, your caregivers, and your needs perhaps not being met in those situations. Mm-hmm. So, for example, maybe if you had really disciplined parents growing up, you might transform that later on in terms of like being extra submissive and then like learning to finally lose control. Or like lots of guilt or shame in your upbringing, maybe you want to try and transform that by being tied up in a hotel room.
Right, but there's never like it does not necessarily need to be a causality. Like, my parents was very dominant, so I like to be submissive. It can like go in different, right? If it was that simple, we would have a better.
It would be like very.
That would be easy. But I think in the article it also says it can go the other way around, right? And maybe you had a very dominant parent, and then you want to explore that dominance and like become that dominant figure or authority.
Yeah, it's no longer
games.
Someone doing it to you, it's you.
You're doing it, right?
Completely.
So in a nutshell, it's just all about processing and coping, how we solve these things. And I guess that also like looking and examining what happened in those years, because we just like start being sexual in our adolescence, and we just like tend to analyze things like as if everything started at that point, and as if we were never like that sexual as kids. And then that's like not quite the case.
Absolutely. It's interesting. For me, like, the more I learn about sexuality and I read this thesis, the farther back I go into those experiences and being like how that influences me, and realizing how moldable, I feel how vulnerable you are as a kid. It's quite interesting to come to terms with that. But then at the same time, I think it's so important to understand these things in order to, what you were saying right now, Olivia, to get the resources to deal with it consciously. And actually, as I was saying maybe at the beginning of this show, like going to BDSM with not necessarily a set goal, but with the awareness that can be something that can help you process those things, as you were saying, Lena, gain control, twist those situations of disempowerment and turn them into empowering situations. I think it's fascinating how much we can gain out of consciously dealing with our sexuality and our sexual fantasies.
Yeah, it can help you so much in your life. I think Justin Lehmiller really made a point of how much it can help you in your relationships, perhaps spicing up your sex life, going and having sex, outside of your home, and, it helps your sex life in that respect. But I think fantasies have the potential to explore a lot more than that.
Expand your horizons.
So a big thank you to listening to our sexual fantasy episode. A big shout out to Justin Lehmiller for taking time and being involved with the Ersties podcast. If you'd like to find out more about his work, please go check out his website, Sex and Psychology by Dr. Justin Lehmiller, or his latest book, Tell Me What You Want. If you'd like to find out more about us, please click subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to our podcast. You can also follow us on Twitter at Ersties Podcast, and visit our website at ersties-podcast.com. Leave us a comment or review as we read them all. Ciao!
The Ersties Podcast.